Judge Thomas Harris sat at the bench, his sharp eyes scanning the courtroom as the cases of the day proceeded one after the other. He was known for his efficiency, his ability to make quick decisions, and for keeping things moving. Today was no different. His focus was on the paperwork in front of him, a series of traffic violations, when the name on the docket caught his attention. Marissa Jenkins. The name sounded vaguely familiar, but he couldn't quite place it. Marissa Jenkins, he called out, his voice clear and authoritative. A woman stepped forward from the defendant's row. She was dressed simply, her hands clasped in front of her as she stood upright. The judge glanced at the file in front of him. An alleged speeding ticket on a residential road, the fine set at $150. He skimmed through the details of the incident, barely lifting his gaze from the paperwork. "Do you have anything to say in your defense?" Judge Harris asked, his tone impassive. The woman, Marissa, looked up at him, her eyes calm yet steady. "No, Your Honor. I was speeding. I'm not making excuses. I got distracted," she replied, her voice low but clear. The simplicity of her answer struck Harris as slightly unusual. Most defendants either tried to talk their way out of things or, if they were guilty, seemed anxious or defensive. Marissa seemed neither, though. She was composed, almost serene, and it made him pause for a split second. She didn't seem like someone who was used to being in a courtroom. Still, the law was the law. "You've been issued a fine of $150, Harris said as he flipped to the next page of her file. "I trust you'll pay it promptly." Court adjourned. The words were mechanical, a standard ruling for a minor offense. Marissa nodded silently, accepting the decision without a word. She turned to leave, walking with a quiet grace that struck the judge as odd. There was something about her demeanor that lingered in his mind, something that stood out from the usual flow of courtroom business. As she exited the courtroom, Harris' gaze followed her for a moment. She was poised, her posture flawless, and though he didn't know it yet, he would soon realize just how much more there was to her than what appeared at first glance. But for now, he simply returned to his duties, unaware that this brief interaction with a quiet, unknown woman would soon lead him down an unexpected path, one that would change his perspective on much more than just the law. That evening, Judge Thomas Harris sat in the back of a dimly lit jazz club, tapping his fingers lightly on the table in front of him. He hadn't intended to come to the show, but a colleague had insisted, offering a ticket as a birthday gift. Harris had little interest in jazz music, but the atmosphere intrigued him. Warm lights, low conversations, and the soft hum of instruments tuning in the background. He had decided to make the best of it, even if he didn't entirely understand the appeal of this genre. As the crowd settled, a hush fell over the room. The lights dimmed further, and the spotlight focused on the stage. A woman stepped up to the microphone, her silhouette framed by the soft glow. She was tall, with an effortless elegance that immediately caught Harris' attention. Her dark hair fell in loose curls around her face, and her eyes held an intensity that contrasted with her calm demeanor. The band behind her struck up a smooth, soulful tune, and the first notes of the saxophone echoed through the room. The woman opened her mouth, and Harris was taken aback. The voice that poured from her was nothing like he expected, powerful, rich, and filled with emotion. It seemed to swirl through the air, wrapping itself around every note with precision and passion. Her voice was smoky, deep with a hint of vulnerability, and it resonated with a kind of raw honesty he hadn't heard in years. He found himself leaning forward, captivated. For the next hour, Marissa Jenkins became the heartbeat of the room. She performed song after song, her music flowing effortlessly, each piece telling a story, each note drenched in meaning. Harris couldn't help but notice how the audience responded, mesmerized, lost in the rhythm. Her connection to the music was palpable, as though the entire crowd was part of a private conversation she was having with herself. Harris watched her intently, almost forgetting where he was. There was a power in her presence, something magnetic. Her performance was the kind that left a mark on your soul, a type of artistry that couldn't be faked. The more he listened, the more familiar her name began to sound. Marissa Jenkins. Where had he heard it before? And then it clicked. She was the same woman from the courtroom, the one he'd found earlier that day. His stomach tightened with a mix of surprise and confusion. How could the woman he'd dismissed so casually in the courtroom be the same person who had just held an entire room in the palm of her hand with nothing but her voice and a microphone? The realization hit him like a jolt, and suddenly, he was no longer just a passive observer. He was drawn in, not only by her music, but by the mystery of who she truly was. Judge Thomas Harris sat in his office the next morning, his thoughts preoccupied by the events of the previous night. He had never been a fan of jazz, but something about Marissa Jenkins' performance had lodged itself in his mind. He found himself replaying the smooth, rich tones of her voice over and over, her energy and presence filling the room long after she'd left the stage. He reached for his coffee, trying to shake the strange feeling that had settled over him. His mind wandered back to the courtroom, to the moment when he had found Marissa. He'd barely looked up from his paperwork as she stood before him, quietly accepting the penalty for her speeding violation. There had been nothing remarkable about the interaction. She'd seemed like just another person caught in the usual ebb and flow of minor offenses. Yet last night, the same woman had transformed into someone entirely different, someone who commanded attention with the strength of her voice and the depth of her music. It was then that the reality of the situation hit him. Marissa Jenkins, the woman whose name he had only vaguely remembered, was the same woman he had dismissed with a routine fine just the day before. The very same woman whose voice now haunted him. He had been so quick to judge her in court, so detached from her humanity. And yet, here she was, a living example of the very art that connected people in ways the law never could. Harris leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. He couldn't believe how unaware he had been. How could he have sat there in judgment, unaware of the woman's true identity? Her presence had been striking, even then, her calm composure, the quiet dignity in her response. But that was all he had seen. Why hadn't I noticed? He wondered. A knock at the door broke his thoughts. His colleague, Judge Reynolds, entered, holding a stack of files. But Harris wasn't really seeing him. His mind was still with Marissa. "You look distracted," Reynolds commented, setting the files down. Harris forced a smile, trying to shake the thoughts swirling in his head. Just thinking about a case from yesterday. One of those days where things just don't add up, you know. Reynolds gave a knowing nod, but Harris couldn't bring himself to share his thoughts. How could he explain to someone that a woman he had fined for a traffic violation the day before had turned out to be one of the most talented musicians he had ever heard? It felt like a strange twist of fate, one that had thrown him off balance. Harris had always prided himself on being able to make quick, fair decisions. But now, the more he thought about it, the more he realized how little he had truly understood about Marissa Jenkins. The disconnect between the woman in his courtroom and the woman on stage was more profound than he had imagined. And for the first time in his career, he questioned whether his judgment was as fair and just as he thought it was. A few days later, as if fate had a hand in it, Judge Thomas Harris found himself standing in line at a local cafe, mindlessly scrolling through his phone while waiting for his coffee. The place was unusually crowded for a Wednesday morning, and he was already late for a meeting at the courthouse. He barely noticed the woman standing in front of him, until she turned slightly, and the familiarity of her face struck him like a lightning bolt. It was Marissa Jenkins. She was dressed casually, in a denim jacket and jeans, her hair pulled back in a loose ponytail. No stage lights, no microphone, just a regular person, standing in line like everyone else. Harris's heart skipped a beat as he stared at her for a moment, unsure whether to say something. He hadn't expected to see her outside the context of the courtroom or the jazz club, and he certainly hadn't anticipated this chance encounter. Marissa caught his gaze and smiled, but there was a hint of recognition in her eyes too. She didn't say anything at first, but then, with a small chuckle, she spoke. "I didn't expect to run into you here, Judge." Harris blinked, slightly startled by the mention of his title. "Marissa, right?" he said, trying to sound casual, though his voice betrayed a hint of awkwardness. I didn't expect to see you either." Her smile widened. "I live around here. Just grabbing a coffee before heading to rehearsal. You know, the usual." "Right," Harris replied, trying to regain his composure. "It's a nice spot." A brief silence followed. The weight of their previous encounter hung between them. Harris couldn't help but feel the lingering discomfort from the courtroom, where he had found her without a second thought. "I wanted to apologize," he blurted out before he could stop himself, "for how I treated you in court the other day. I didn't know who you were, and I should have given you more respect. I wasn't exactly fair." Marissa raised an eyebrow, taken aback by the unexpected apology. She paused, studying him for a moment. "It's okay, Judge. You were just doing your job, right?" Harris winced, the words sounding hollow even as he spoke them. "Maybe, but I didn't take the time to really see you. I didn't realize you're an extraordinary musician. I saw you perform the other night." Her eyes softened, and she nodded. "I appreciate that. It means a lot." There was a pause as they both took a moment to absorb the unexpected connection forming between them. It was strange, Harris thought. Here they were, two people from very different worlds, brought together by nothing more than chance and a series of small decisions. He felt an odd sense of relief. Maybe this was his opportunity to understand her beyond the courtroom, beyond the roles they played. "Well," Marissa said after a beat, "it's nice to have a friendly face around here. Maybe we'll run into each other again." Harris nodded, a genuine smile tugging at his lips. "I'd like that." As they both grabbed their drinks and parted ways, Harris couldn't shake the feeling that this chance meeting wasn't as random as it seemed. Over the next few days, Judge Thomas Harris couldn't shake the memory of his encounter with Marissa Jenkins. The brief conversation in the cafe had left him unsettled in a way he hadn't anticipated. He had apologized, yes, but something about the way she had accepted it with such grace had made him realize how little he truly understood about her. The contrast between the woman in the courtroom and the one he had met in the coffee shop was stark, and it left him wondering about the story he had missed, the story beyond the fine, beyond the surface. As a judge, Harris was accustomed to making quick, efficient judgments based on the facts before him. It was part of the job, part of his role in maintaining order. But now, with Marissa, he found himself questioning his approach. What had he missed in that brief courtroom interaction? What had he failed to see in her quiet demeanor that day? Harris spent the next several evenings attending more of Marissa's performances. He'd never considered himself a jazz fan, but there was something about her music that kept pulling him back. Her voice was hypnotic, a mix of vulnerability and strength, and the way she connected with her audience felt almost intimate. He sat at the back of the club, watching her from the shadows, a silent observer, trying to understand the depth of her artistry. With every note, he saw a different side of her, a side he had never imagined. She wasn't just a musician. She was an artist, pouring her heart and soul into every song. Each performance told a story, weaving emotion and experience into something far more powerful than a simple melody. Harris couldn't help but marvel at how much of herself she gave to her music, how much of her own struggles and triumphs bowled through every lyric. One night, after a particularly stirring performance, Harris found himself standing outside the venue, waiting for her to finish packing up. When she stepped out, her face lit up with a smile that made him feel like he had just stepped into a different world. "Enjoy the show?" she asked, her voice warm and unguarded. "I did," Harris said, his tone more sincere than he expected. "I've been coming to see you perform a lot lately. I'm beginning to understand why you're so well known." Marissa raised an eyebrow. "So I've converted you into a jazz fan now?" He smiled slightly. "I think so. There's something about your music. It's not just the sound. It's the way you carry yourself, the way you make every song feel like it's yours." I admire it." Her expression softened. "Thank you. That means a lot." She paused, considering him for a moment. "You know, it's not often people get past the surface with me. You're the first person who's really seemed to listen." Harris felt a pang of guilt, realizing just how little he had listened before. "I think I've been looking at things the wrong way. I want to understand your world, what it's really like for you, beyond the stage and the court." Marissa regarded him quietly, as if weighing the sincerity of his words. Finally, she nodded. "Well, I'm happy to share, but be warned, there's a lot more to it than you might expect." For the first time, Harris felt as though he was beginning to see her, not just as a defendant or a performer, but as a person with her own story to tell, and he was more than willing to listen. The following weeks saw a shift in the dynamic between Judge Thomas Harris and Marissa Jenkins. What began as a casual apology and an unexpected meeting had gradually developed into something more, a genuine connection. Harris, ever the observer, found himself not just intrigued by Marissa's music, but by the woman herself. He attended her performances with regularity, each time staying longer, listening more intently, and slowly realizing how much he had missed before. He began to understand that her music was not just a form of entertainment. It was her way of telling her life story, a story Harris had never even considered. One evening, after a particularly moving show, Marissa invited him to join her for a drink at a nearby cafe. They found a quiet corner, away from the bustle of the crowd. Harris sat across from her, watching the way she seemed at ease in the space, her energy grounded but still dynamic. It was a stark contrast to the polished, authoritative image he maintained in the courtroom. He couldn't help but admire her for it. Marissa stirred her coffee, her fingers tapping lightly on the side of the cup. "You've been coming to my shows a lot," she remarked, offering him a smile. "I'm surprised you still find it interesting." "I do," Harris replied, leaning forward slightly. "I've been thinking a lot about what you said, how people rarely see past the surface with you. You've got a story that's more than just the music, don't you?" Marissa's expression softened. She paused for a moment, as though considering how much of her story she was willing to share. Then, with a slight sigh, she nodded. "You're right," she said quietly. "It's not just the music. That's the easiest part of my life. But behind it, there's a lot more stuff I don't always talk about. Things I don't share with just anyone." Harris sat back, sensing the weight of her words. "You don't have to tell me if you don't want to. But if you ever feel like sharing, I'm listening." For a long moment, Marissa didn't speak. She stared out the window, watching the rain begin to fall softly on the pavement outside. Finally, she began to open up. "I didn't always have it easy," she began, her voice tinged with a quiet sadness. "I grew up in a neighborhood where opportunities were scarce. Music was my escape. It was the only thing that made me feel like I had a chance. But even then, it wasn't always accepted. I had to fight for every gig, every chance to be heard." She paused, her fingers curling around the coffee cup. "And even now, as successful as I am, there are still doors that don't open for me just because of who I am, or how I look." Harris listened intently, the guilt from their initial encounter returning in full force. He had seen none of this, the struggles, the sacrifices, the raw determination that had driven her to become the artist she was. All he had seen was a woman in front of him who needed to be fined, someone to whom he had applied the law without understanding the larger picture. "I had no idea," he admitted quietly, feeling a twinge of shame. "I should have been more aware." Marissa gave him a small, understanding smile. "It's not your fault. People don't always see the full picture, and sometimes I don't expect them to. But it's nice to have someone listen." As they sat in the warmth of the cafe, Harris felt a shift inside himself. He was beginning to realize that this wasn't just about an apology. It was about understanding, empathy, and truly seeing another person for who they were, not just the roles they played in the world. And for the first time, He wondered what his life might be like if he started doing that more often. In the weeks that followed their conversation at the cafe, Judge Thomas Harris and Marissa Jenkins began to share more than just small talk. Their meetings, now more frequent, became a space for honesty. Harris had started to question everything he once thought he knew about fairness, about judgment, and about his own biases. Marissa's story had opened his eyes to the gaps in his understanding, gaps he hadn't even realized existed until now. He found himself reflecting on the many people he had sentenced over the years. Like Marissa, many of them were more than the offenses they'd committed. Each person had a story, a history that extended far beyond what was presented in the courtroom. In his position, Harris had always believed in the law's impartiality, that the rules were clear-cut and needed to be upheld without exception. But Marissa had made him realize how often he had overlooked the larger context, how the law didn't always account for the complexities of a person's life. One evening, after a performance, Marissa invited him backstage to chat. It was a quiet, intimate space, filled with the soft hum of musicians packing up their instruments and the clinking of glasses. Harris, standing there in his suit amidst the casual atmosphere, felt out of place. But Marissa made him feel welcome, as if his presence was part of the rhythm of her life. "Do you think you'll ever take a step back from your work?" she asked as they settled into a small corner, her voice casual but with an underlying seriousness. "I mean, being a judge, it's a heavy role. Doesn't it ever get to you?" Harris considered her question carefully. He had spent his career building walls around himself, compartmentalizing his work from his personal life. But now, with Marissa's questions and insights, those walls seemed to be crumbling. "I've never really thought about it," he admitted. "I've always believed in the importance of what I do, being fair, keeping order, making decisions that affect people's lives. But I've also started to wonder if I'm doing it the right way, if I'm really seeing people for who they are." Marissa's gaze softened. "It's easy to get caught up in what we're supposed to do, right? But sometimes the way we see people can shape their reality. We can either make them feel seen or make them feel invisible." The words hung in the air between them, settling deep into Harris' mind. He realized that Marissa wasn't just an artist sharing her music with him. She was challenging him to reconsider everything he had built his career upon. Her life wasn't just a reflection of resilience. It was a lesson in humanity, and he was beginning to see it in a way he never had before. The more he listened, the more Harris felt the weight of his past decisions, his judgments, the countless lives he had affected with a gavel strike. But rather than retreating into defensiveness, he felt a strange sense of relief. For the first time, he wasn't seeing the law as the end-all solution. He was seeing the people behind the cases, and Marissa, with her grace, her struggles, and her music, had made him realize just how much he had been missing. "I think I've got a lot to learn," he said softly, almost to himself. Marissa smiled, her eyes filled with understanding. "We all do, Judge. We all do." Judge Thomas Harris stood in the courtroom the following week, feeling a profound sense of unease. It wasn't because of the cases before him. He'd seen hundreds of similar situations in his career. No, the discomfort came from the realization that, despite his years of experience, he had been blind to the humanity behind the proceedings. Sitting at the bench, surrounded by the same cold, formal routine he had followed for years, Harris felt an unfamiliar weight in the air, as if everything had shifted, but no one else noticed. He glanced over at the defendant in front of him, a young man caught in a petty theft charge. As the prosecutor spoke, Harris thought back to his recent conversations with Marissa. Her words echoed in his mind. "The way we see people can shape their reality. We can either make them feel seen or make them feel invisible." For the first time, he saw the young man not just as a case number or a criminal, but as a person, perhaps someone who had grown up in a broken home, who lacked the opportunities he needed, who had made a mistake out of desperation. The thought that the law might be too blunt, too detached, to account for the complexities of real life sat heavily with him. When the court session concluded, Harris made a decision. He called for a brief recess and retreated to his office. He spent the next hour reflecting, considering all the moments when he had acted swiftly and with finality, unaware of the full story. It wasn't that he hadn't followed the law. It was that he had never taken the time to see beyond the legalities. He had treated people as cases, not lives. Marissa's influence had grown into something more than just an educational experience. She had opened his eyes to a new way of seeing the world. It was more than a lesson in empathy. It was a lesson in humility. He knew, in that moment, that he couldn't continue this way, doing his job without fully seeing the people in front of him. As he sat there, deep in thought, a knock on his door interrupted him. It was his clerk, offering a file for his next case, but Harris paused before taking it. "I need to make a change," he said quietly, more to himself than to her. "I'm going to spend some time learning about the people in my court. Before I pass judgment, I want to understand them." The clerk looked at him, slightly taken aback, but Harris' mind was made up. That afternoon, Harris met with the young man who had been facing the theft charges. Instead of a standard sentence, he asked the young man to speak, to share his story. Harris listened carefully, asking questions, engaging with the young man's background, his struggles, and his aspirations. It wasn't easy, but Harris realized that this was how justice was truly meant to be administered, not just by the book, but by understanding the whole person. Later, when Harris sat down to review Marissa's latest performance, this time, it wasn't just about her music. It was about the lessons she had imparted on him, lessons that were beginning to change not only his career but his entire view of justice. He no longer saw his role as merely delivering sentences. He now saw himself as a part of the process of understanding, of helping people find their way, not just through the law, but through life. As Marissa's voice echoed through his thoughts, Harris smiled, grateful for the chance encounter that had changed everything. He knew now that there was more to his job, more to life, than simply judging. There was a deeper, more human truth waiting to be uncovered, and he was ready to find it.